What does it mean to be the most brilliant mind in the universe when your voice is not your own, and your thoughts must pass through other hands before they reach the world? Prologue. The voice that wasn't. His Stephen Hawking spent half a century unable to move, unable to speak without a machine, unable to write a single equation with his own hand. Yet he reshaped our understanding of black holes, time, and the origin of everything. He became the most famous scientist on Earth, a man whose synthetic American accent was instantly recognizable, whose image in a motorized wheelchair became synonymous with genius itself. But Stephen Hawking was never alone. Behind every lecture, every equation, every carefully composed sentence, there existed an invisible architecture. Graduate students who drew the diagrams he could only imagine, nurses who interpreted the twitch of an eyebrow, assistants who anticipated needs before he could express them, a computer that translated the smallest finger movement into language. He was not one mind, but a system, a collective intelligence distributed across human bodies and silicon chips, held together by something more fragile than we ever wanted to admit. This is not a story of triumph over adversity. It is a story about what genius actually requires, about the hidden labor that makes brilliance visible, about a man who could see to the edge of the universe but could not tie his own shoes, about fame that isolated even as it celebrated, about love that became obligation, an obligation that calcified into something harder to name. It is a story about transmission, how thought travels from one mind to the world when the body between them has nearly disappeared. Chapter 1: A Childhood of Equations and Silence. Stephen William Hawking was born on January 8, 1942, in Oxford, England, exactly 300 years after the death of Galileo, a coincidence he would later mention with the particular pleasure of someone who understood that the universe was full of patterns that meant nothing and everything at once. His parents were intellectuals by necessity and eccentricity by choice. Frank Hawking, a medical researcher specializing in tropical diseases, had escaped the bombing of London with his pregnant wife Isabel, an Oxford philosophy graduate working as a medical secretary. They were the kind of people who read at the dinner table, who kept bees in the basement and lived in a house in St. Albans that was slowly, imperceptibly falling apart around them. Windows broken, heating uncertain, rooms filled with books no one would ever finish. Stephen was not a prodigy in the obvious sense. He learned to read late. His handwriting was legendarily poor, an early preview of a body that would never quite cooperate with the precision his mind demanded. At school, he was clever but unexceptional, coasting on natural ability while investing almost no effort. He built computers out of discarded telephone switchboards and clock parts, not because he was studying electronics, but because puzzles entertained him, and formal instruction bored him nearly to unconsciousness. At St. Albans School, his peers nicknamed him Einstein, half mockery, half recognition that something about him was different, though no one could say exactly what. He gave the impression of someone who was present, but not particularly interested in being so. A boy who could see patterns others couldn't, but saw no reason to explain them. In 1959, he arrived at Oxford to study physics. He was 17. His father had wanted him to pursue medicine, something practical, something that might lead to a conventional career. Stephen refused with the quiet stubbornness that would define much of his life. Physics was where the real questions lived. The nature of time, the structure of space. Questions that had no immediate use. which was precisely why they mattered. Oxford did not challenge him. He attended perhaps 3 hours of lectures a week, and estimated he worked, in total, about an hour a day. He joined the rowing team, not as an oarsman, but as a coxswain, the small person who steers and shouts instructions, contributing not strength but strategy. It was a role that required authority without physical power, a pattern that would recur. He graduated with a first-class degree in 1962 by performing brilliantly on the final examination after 3 years of near total indifference. He had discovered he could get by on innate talent and last-minute cramming, a realization that was both liberating and corrosive. He was clever enough not to have to try, which meant he had never learned how to struggle, how to persist when understanding did not arrive immediately. He had also begun to notice something else, a certain clumsiness, a tendency to stumble or drop things. Nothing alarming, just the vague sense that his body was becoming less reliable, as though the connection between intention and action was beginning to fray. Chapter 2: Diagnosis: The Beginning of Dependency. In January 1963, shortly after arriving at Cambridge to pursue a PhD in cosmology, Stephen Hawking fell down a flight of stairs. He went to a doctor. Tests followed. More tests, weeks in the hospital. Then a diagnosis that arrived without ceremony or comfort: amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a progressive motor neuron disease. His muscles would weaken. His ability to move, to speak, to swallow, would deteriorate. The doctors gave him 2 years, perhaps a little more. There was no treatment, no hope of recovery, only the certainty of decline. He was 21 years old. What followed was not immediate defiance or courage. It was, by his own account, a period of withdrawal and depression. He stayed in his room. He drank too much. He listened to Wagner at high volume, Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, an opera about the end of everything. He saw no point in completing a PhD he would not live to use. The future had been removed, and with it, any reason to work. But something shifted. He visited the hospital again and saw a boy dying of leukemia in the bed across from him. The boy's suffering was immediate and absolute. Hawking's disease, by contrast, was slow. He still had time. Perhaps not much, but more than some. Around the same time, he met Jane Wilde at a New Year's party, just before his diagnosis. She was studying languages at Cambridge, sharp and serious, with a faith that seemed to him both incomprehensible and somehow stabilizing. They began seeing each other. When he told her about his condition, she did not leave. She made a choice that would define both their lives. She decided to stay. That choice, her choice, may have saved him. Not from the disease, which could not be stopped, but from the slower death of surrender. With someone to live for, he had a reason to work again. He returned to his research. He proposed to Jane in 1964, and she accepted, knowing exactly what she was agreeing to. They married in July 1965. By then, Hawking was using a cane. His speech was slurred but comprehensible. He could still write, though his handwriting had deteriorated further. The 2-year prognosis came and went. He was still alive, still thinking, still capable, for now, of a kind of independence that he understood was temporary. Jane became the first member of what would eventually become an extensive support system. She managed the household, advocated for his needs at the university, pushed his wheelchair, deciphered his increasingly difficult speech. She also pursued her own academic work, raising their children, Robert, born in 1967, Lucy in 1970, Timothy in 1979, while Stephen's career accelerated and his body continued its inexorable decline. This was the beginning of the system, though no one called it that yet. It was simply what survival required. Stephen needed help. Jane provided it. The arrangement seemed temporary because they both believed, or wanted to believe, that there might still be time before the disease completed its work. But the disease was slower than anyone expected, and the system, once assembled, would only grow more complex. Chapter 3: The Early System, Jane, Cambridge, and Contingency. By the late 1960s, Stephen Hawking's physical condition had stabilized into a kind of uneasy equilibrium. He had not died. He had not, in fact, deteriorated as rapidly as predicted. The disease progressed, but slowly enough that he could still function. Barely, precariously, but function nonetheless. He could no longer walk unaided. He used crutches, then a wheelchair. His speech had become slurred, to the point where only those closest to him, Jane, his students, a few colleagues, could understand him reliably. He could not write by hand. He could not perform the long algebraic calculations that were standard in theoretical physics. He had to think differently, compensate with geometric intuition, rely on visualization rather than manipulation of symbols. These limitations, paradoxically, shaped his intellectual style. Unable to write out equations line by line, he learned to think in pictures, to hold entire diagrams in his mind. He became adept at Penrose-Carter diagrams, visual representations of space-time that compressed complex mathematical relationships into geometric forms. Where other physicists calculated, Hawking imagined. Where others checked their work with algebra, he developed an almost tactile sense for whether a result felt right, whether the structure of space-time would permit what the equations seemed to suggest. His early work, conducted in collaboration with Roger Penrose, concerned singularities, points in space-time where the known laws of physics break down. Penrose had proven that under certain conditions, a collapsing star must form a singularity, a black hole from which nothing, not even light, can escape. Hawking extended this reasoning backward in time, arguing that if the universe was expanding, then running the clock in reverse implied it must have originated in a singularity as well. The Big Bang. These were not easy results to obtain. They required sophisticated mathematics, long chains of reasoning, and an ability to hold multiple abstract concepts in simultaneous relation. Hawking could do this. What he could not do was write it down himself. His graduate students performed the calculations, drew the diagrams, translated his verbal ideas into formal proofs. Jane managed his schedule, typed his papers, communicated with colleagues when his speech became incomprehensible. The university provided minimal support. Cambridge in the 1960s was not designed for accessibility, so the system was improvised, personal, held together by Jane's exhaustion and Hawking's relentless focus. The arrangement worked after a fashion, but it also created dependencies that were unequal and unsustainable. Jane had entered the marriage believing she could manage care, children, and her own academic aspirations. She discovered incrementally that she could not, or rather, she could, but only by making herself into an extension of Stephen's needs: chauffeur, interpreter, advocate, nurse. Her own PhD languished. Her life contracted around his. She later described feeling like she had been reduced to a series of functions: someone to dress him, feed him, decipher his words, manage logistics. The intellectual partnership she had imagined became something more instrumental. Stephen's work proceeded. Her work did not. This was not cruelty on his part. It was necessity, or what felt like necessity. His body was failing. His mind was not. If he was to contribute anything, if he was to justify the time he had been unexpectedly given, then everything else, domesticity, emotional reciprocity, acknowledgement of Jane's sacrifices, had to be secondary. He did not speak of his illness. He did not discuss the future. He maintained what Jane would later call a facade of normality, proceeding as though the wheelchair and the slurred speech were minor inconveniences, rather than daily humiliations and constant reminders of mortality. In Cambridge, he cultivated a reputation as brilliant and difficult. He drove his wheelchair recklessly through the cobbled streets, scattering pedestrians, grinning when he clipped someone's ankle. He made bets with colleagues, small wagers with absurd stakes, like a year's subscription to Penthouse magazine, on unresolved questions in physics. He displayed a kind of defiant playfulness, as though daring the universe to take him seriously. But at home, there was silence about what mattered most. Jane's faith clashed with Stephen's atheism. She sought solace in church. He refused to discuss his prognosis or his feelings about it. She wanted partnership. He needed support. The distinction, subtle at first, would widen into a chasm over the next 2 decades. Still, in those early years, before fame, before the full weight of his condition settled, there was something almost ordinary about their life. Children, dinner parties with colleagues, Stephen working in his office while Jane managed the household. The system was small, personal, barely visible. It had not yet become a machine. Chapter 4: Hawking Radiation, a Discovery, Passed Through Others. In 1974, Stephen Hawking made the discovery that would define his scientific legacy. He proved, using a combination of quantum mechanics and general relativity, that black holes are not entirely black. They emit radiation. They evaporate, slowly, over cosmological timescales, releasing energy back into the universe until eventually they disappear. This was not intuitive. Black holes were supposed to be the ultimate traps, regions of space-time from which nothing could escape. The event horizon, the boundary beyond which even light cannot return, was thought to be absolute. Hawking showed it was not. Quantum effects near the horizon allowed particles to escape, a process now known as Hawking radiation. The result was astonishing. It suggested that black holes had a temperature, that they obeyed thermodynamic laws, that information about what fell into them might be lost forever, a possibility that violated fundamental principles of quantum mechanics and would spark decades of debate, the so-called black hole information paradox. When Hawking first presented this idea at a conference, his audience was skeptical. Some thought it was wrong. Others thought it was brilliant but unverifiable. Black hole evaporation would take longer than the age of the universe, so no one would ever observe it directly. But over time, the physics community came to accept it. Hawking radiation became one of the canonical results of modern theoretical physics, a bridge between quantum theory and gravity, a hint of the deeper theory that still eluded everyone. And yet, Hawking did not discover this alone. He could not perform the detailed calculations himself. His hands no longer functioned well enough to write. His speech was difficult enough that extended technical discussions were impractical. He needed intermediaries, graduate students who could translate his intuitions into formal mathematics, colleagues who could check the derivations, collaborators who could extend the arguments. The discovery emerged from a network. Hawking had the insight, the conceptual leap, but the execution, the verification, the elaboration, that was collective work, distributed across multiple minds and hands. The paper that announced the result bore his name alone, as was conventional for a professor's original idea. But the labor was shared in ways that authorship did not reflect. This was not unusual in science. Advisors routinely claim credit for work their students perform. The hierarchies of academia are well established. But in Hawking's case, the dependence was more visible, more total. He could not pretend to have done the work himself, because everyone knew he physically could not. The gap between insight and inscription was obvious. His students understood this. They described their role in terms that were both deferential and essential. Hawking would propose a problem, offer a vague direction, or a geometric intuition. They would spend weeks or months working out the mathematics, calculating, checking, drawing diagrams. They would return with results. He would look at them, think, respond, with yes or no, sometimes a brief comment. If yes, they continued. If no, they started again. Communication was slow. A single conversation could take hours. He would type out responses on a keyboard, one laborious letter at a time, or rely on yes. No questions interpreted by those who knew him well enough to anticipate what he might be thinking. His students learned to read his face. An eyebrow raise meant yes, a downward glance meant no. A particular grimace indicated frustration or disagreement. This mode of interaction required patience and a kind of interpretive labor that went beyond normal academic mentorship. His students were not just solving problems. They were translating between Hawking's internal geometric reasoning and the formal symbolic language of physics. They were, in effect, externalizing his thought process, making visible what he could no longer make visible himself. The result was a strange kind of authorship. Hawking's name appeared on the papers. His ideas drove the research. But the words, the equations, the diagrams, those came from others. He was the architect, but he could not build. He was the composer, but he could not play. And yet no one doubted that these were his discoveries. The ideas bore his signature, a particular style of thinking, visual and intuitive, willing to make bold conjectures, unafraid of paradox. Hawking radiation was his, even if his hands never wrote the equations. This was the paradox of distributed genius. The work was collective, but the credit was individual. The system made the discovery possible, but the system remained invisible. What the world saw was Stephen Hawking, solitary mind, conquering black holes. What his students saw was something more complicated, a brilliant man who needed them absolutely, and who could not have produced anything without them. Chapter 5. Fame. The construction of Hawking trademark. In 1988, Stephen Hawking published A Brief History of Time, From the Big Bang to Black Holes. It was intended as a popular science book for a general audience, an attempt to explain cosmology without equations, accessible to anyone curious about the universe. It became something else entirely, a cultural phenomenon, a bestseller that remained on the Sunday Times list for a record-breaking 237 weeks. The book made Hawking famous in a way few scientists ever experience. He became a global icon, a household name, a figure recognizable even to people who had never read the book and could not have explained what Hawking radiation was. His image, seated in a motorized wheelchair, hands twisted, gazing upward as though seeing beyond the visible world, became synonymous with genius itself. The media loved him. Here was a story that satisfied every narrative hunger. A man whose body had betrayed him, but whose mind soared to the cosmos. A scientist trapped in a wheelchair who could explain black holes. A voice synthesized by a machine that spoke truths about the origin of everything. He was both pitiable and awe-inspiring, human and superhuman, a living symbol of mind triumphing over matter. The media coverage followed predictable patterns. Profiles emphasized his disability first, his science second. They recycled the same biographical details. Born on the anniversary of Galileo's death, diagnosed at 21, given 2 years to live, defied the odds. They quoted the same lines from his book, often out of context, particularly the closing sentence about knowing the mind of God. They presented him as a solitary genius, a modern Einstein, perhaps the smartest person alive. Hawking did not entirely resist this myth-making. He understood its utility. Fame brought funding, attention to his work, opportunities to advocate for science and disability rights. He gave interviews, appeared on television, accepted invitations to the White House and Buckingham Palace. He even made cameo appearances on Star Trek, The Next Generation, and The Simpsons, playing a version of himself that was part scientist, part cultural icon, part inside joke. But the fame also distorted him. The public Hawking, the figure constructed by media narratives, book sales, and carefully staged appearances, was not the same as the private person. The public Hawking was disembodied intellect, pure mind, heroic sufferer. The private Hawking was dependent, irritable, sometimes difficult, sustained by an extensive network of caregivers, students, and assistants whose labor remained invisible. The production of public appearances required meticulous preparation. Talks were scripted in advance, pre-programmed, into a speech synthesizer, so he could deliver them with the appearance of fluency. Questions from the audience were anticipated, answers prepared beforehand. Journalists who interviewed him often received written responses rather than real-time conversation, or they interviewed his assistants and colleagues instead, piecing together a portrait of a man they rarely spoke with directly. The machine that generated his voice became inseparable from his identity. The synthetic American accent, a quirk of the particular speech synthesizer he used, became his voice, more recognizable than his natural speaking voice had ever been. When newer, more natural-sounding synthesizers became available, he refused them. The robotic monotone was, by then, part of who Stephen Hawking was. To change it would be to lose something essential, even if that essential thing was itself artificial. This was the central irony of his fame. The more visible he became, the more mediated his presence. The world saw Stephen Hawking everywhere, on magazine covers and documentaries, at conferences. But what they saw was a construct, a carefully managed persona assembled by publicists, assistants, collaborators, and the media itself. The closer one approached, the more elusive he became. Physical proximity did not grant access to the man. It revealed only the mechanisms of his construction. In 1991, filmmaker Errol Morris released a documentary also titled A Brief History of Time, a cinematic meditation on Hawking's life and work. It was beautifully shot, philosophically ambitious, and oddly evasive. Morris interviewed Hawking's family, colleagues, and former students, but Hawking himself remained at a distance, mediated by his computer, by the camera, by the structure of the film. The documentary conveyed the paradox of Hawking's presence. He was everywhere and nowhere, the subject of the film, yet somehow absent from it. Morris later said that filming Hawking was one of the most difficult experiences of his career. The logistical challenges were immense, coordinating Hawking's schedule, managing his medical needs, working around the slowness of his communication. But the deeper challenge was representational. How do you film genius? How do you show thought happening when the thinker's body is nearly still and his words emerge from a machine? Morris solved this, in part, by not trying. He filmed Hawking in his office, in his wheelchair, surrounded by books and papers. He filmed the computer, the synthesizer, the assistants hovering just out of frame. He allowed the silence, the waiting, the mechanical awkwardness. What emerged was not a portrait of a disembodied mind, but of a profoundly embodied one. Embodied not in his own flesh, which could do so little, but in the network of people and machines that enabled him to exist in the world. And yet, the myth persisted. Despite the documentary's subtlety, despite the visible apparatus of his dependence, the public continued to see Hawking as a lone genius. The system remained invisible, or at least unacknowledged. This was what fame required: simplification, mythologization, the erasure of complexity in favor of a story people could understand and, admire. By the early 1990s, Stephen Hawking was no longer just a physicist. He was Hawking TM, a brand, an icon, a symbol that transcended the man. And the man himself, increasingly, was subsumed by that symbol, shaped by the expectations it created, constrained by the image it projected. Chapter 6. The Paradox of Presence, being heard. Without speaking, to speak with Stephen Hawking was to engage in an act of radical patience. Conversations proceeded in fragments and silences. He would compose a response on his computer, one slow letter at a time, cursor moving across the screen as he activated a switch with a barely perceptible movement of his cheek or finger. Each sentence could take minutes. Complex ideas required entire afternoons. The rhythm of exchange was nothing like normal conversation, no overlapping speech, no quick back and forth, no spontaneous laughter. Just waiting, watching, interpreting the faint changes in his expression while the machine assembled words. For those who knew him well, longtime colleagues, close students, family, a secondary mode of communication developed. They learned to read him. An eyebrow raised meant yes. Eyes shifting downward meant no. A particular tightening around his mouth indicated frustration or pain. His assistants became expert interpreters, able to conduct entire yes-no conversations without the computer, translating his minimal physical cues into actionable meaning. This created an intimacy that was paradoxically impersonal. To communicate with Hawking was to merge with the system that sustained him, to become part of the apparatus that translated his interior thought into public expression. You did not speak to Stephen Hawking alone. You spoke to Hawking plus computer, Hawking plus assistant, Hawking plus the collective memory of everyone who knew him well enough to anticipate what he might say. The ethnographer Hélène Mialet, who studied Hawking's life and work for her book Hawking Incorporated described the experience of interviewing him as profoundly disorienting. She would ask a question, silence, long, uncomfortable silence. Hawking's face revealed almost nothing. The assistant stood nearby, watchful. Finally, after several minutes, the synthesizer would speak, and the answer would emerge. Thoughtful, precise, sometimes wry, but disconnected from the physical body that had produced it. The voice came from the machine. The thought came from Hawking. But where exactly was Hawking? Miley concluded that Hawking's identity was distributed, not located in his brain alone, but spread across a network of humans and machines. His intellect was exteriorized, made tangible through the diagrams his students drew, the equations they calculated, the words his computer spoke. He was, in her formulation, a distributed centered subject, singular and irreducible, yet constituted entirely through his relationships with others and with technology. This was not a metaphor. It was a description of how he actually functioned. Remove the computer and he could not speak. Remove the assistants and he could not eat, dress, move from one room to another. Remove the students and he could not publish. His genius was real, his insights his own, but their realization depended on an infrastructure that most people never saw. The paradox was that physical proximity to Hawking often made this more apparent, not less. Journalists who came expecting to encounter a great mind frequently left frustrated or confused. The interview process was mediated, slow, impersonal. The man himself seemed absent or at least inaccessible, hidden behind layers of technological and human intermediation. At a distance, through his books or public lectures, Hawking seemed present, coherent, authoritative. Up close, he fragmented into pieces: body, machine, assistant, voice, that did not quite cohere into a unified self. This troubled the conventional understanding of scientific genius, which assumes a direct line from mind to discovery to world. We want to believe that ideas emerge fully formed from brilliant individuals, that great scientists think their thoughts alone, and then communicate them transparently. Hawking's case exposed that as fiction. Ideas do not emerge alone. They are shaped by conversation, by collaboration, by the tools available to think with. And for Hawking, the tools were people. His graduate students described a peculiar dynamic. They would work on a problem for weeks, perform intricate calculations, prepare detailed results. Then they would meet with Hawking. He would look at their work, sometimes for only a few moments, and respond. Yes, this is right. No, this is wrong. Try this instead. His judgments were usually correct, his intuitions reliable. But the process was oracular, almost mystical. He could not explain his reasoning in the way another physicist might, walking through each step. He saw patterns, felt structures, knew whether a solution was correct, without needing to verify it algebraically. This was partly compensation for his physical limitations. Unable to perform long calculations, he had developed an extraordinary geometric intuition, a way of visualizing space-time that bypassed symbolic manipulation. But it also meant that much of his reasoning was internalized, inaccessible to others, communicable only through the yes-no judgments he could express. His students sometimes felt like they were trying to read the mind of a sphinx. They would propose an idea. He would think. The silence would stretch. Then, finally, the computer would speak. No, that's not quite right. And they would start again, refining, recalculating, trying to align their work with an intuition they could not fully access. This made collaboration both essential and difficult. Hawking needed his students absolutely, but the collaboration was asymmetric. He could not write, could not draw, could not show them how he was thinking. They had to infer, interpret, guess. The intellectual labor was shared, but the epistemological access was not. They worked for him, with him, but never quite inside his thought process, and yet they stayed. They admired him. They found the work intellectually thrilling, even when it was frustrating. To work with Hawking was to be part of something significant, to contribute to discoveries that mattered. The system functioned, even if it was awkward and unequal, because everyone involved believed in the work. But belief is not the same as sustainability, and as Hawking's fame grew, as the demands on his time multiplied, the system began to strain under its own weight. Chapter 7: Betrayal, Autonomy, and Collapse. By the mid-1980s, the arrangement that had sustained Stephen Hawking for 2 decades was unraveling. Jane had been his primary caregiver since their marriage in 1965. She had managed the household, raised their 3 children, interpreted his increasingly difficult speech, navigated the university bureaucracy, typed his papers, advocated for accessibility accommodations that Cambridge was reluctant to provide. She had done this while also attempting to complete her own PhD in medieval poetry, a project that took her decades because she could never find time to focus on it fully. The toll was immense. She later described feeling like she had been reduced to a set of functions: chauffeur, nurse, valet, secretary. The emotional partnership she had hoped for never fully materialized. Stephen did not talk about his feelings. He did not discuss his illness or his prognosis. He maintained a facade of normality, proceeding as though the wheelchair and the ventilator were minor inconveniences, rather than daily confrontations with mortality. Jane's faith, which had once provided her with strength, became a point of friction. She was a devout Christian. Stephen was a committed atheist who saw religion as, at best, irrelevant and, at worst, an intellectual failure. They did not argue about this directly. Stephen avoided conflict, but the gap widened, unstated and unbridgeable. She found solace elsewhere. A family friend, Jonathan Hillier-Jones, a choir master at their local church, became a close companion. The relationship, by all accounts, remained platonic for years, but it provided Jane with the emotional support and intellectual companionship she was not receiving from Stephen. Jonathan helped with the children, spent time with the family, and became a de facto member of the household. Stephen tolerated this arrangement, perhaps because it relieved him of certain emotional obligations, perhaps because he recognized that Jane needed something he could not provide. In 1985, everything changed. While traveling in Geneva for a conference, Stephen contracted pneumonia. His condition deteriorated rapidly. He was placed on a ventilator. The doctors asked Jane whether they should turn off life support. She refused. She insisted he be flown back to Cambridge, where a tracheotomy was performed to allow him to breathe. The tracheotomy saved his life. It also took away his voice. Before the surgery, Stephen's speech had been slurred and difficult, but those who knew him could still understand him. After the surgery, he could not speak at all. He was entirely mute. For weeks, he communicated only through yes-no signals, raising his eyebrows for yes, looking down for no. It was a return to the most primitive form of interaction, a near total loss of expressive capacity. Eventually, a computer scientist named Walt Woltosz provided a solution, a speech synthesis program that could be operated with a hand switch. Stephen would select letters and words from a screen, and the computer would speak them aloud in a flat, synthetic American accent. It was laborious, but it worked. He had a voice again, not his own, but functional. The new system required full-time technical and medical support. Jane could no longer manage his care alone. The university and the National Health Service provided some resources, but it was not enough. Stephen needed round-the-clock nursing. He needed assistance to operate and maintain his computer system. He needed someone to coordinate his increasingly complex schedule of lectures, conferences, media appearances, and research. One of the nurses assigned to his care was Elaine Mason. She was competent, assertive, and unafraid of Stephen's fame or his condition. Where Jane had been dutiful and self-sacrificing, Elaine was direct and unapologetic. She managed his needs efficiently, but she also engaged with him in a way that felt, to Stephen, like recognition rather than obligation. An emotional entanglement developed. It is not clear when it crossed from professional to personal, but by the late 1980s, it had. In 1990, Stephen abruptly left Jane and moved in with Elaine. He offered no extended explanation, no prolonged discussion. He simply left. Jane was devastated, though not entirely surprised. She later wrote that she had felt increasingly peripheral in Stephen's life, eclipsed by his fame and by the entourage of students, assistants, and admirers that surrounded him. His departure confirmed what she had sensed for years, that she was necessary but not valued, essential to his survival, but not to his sense of self. Stephen and Jane divorced in 1995. He married Elaine shortly thereafter. Jane eventually married Jonathan, the man who had been her companion through the hardest years. The public mostly did not know about this. The media still presented Hawking as a heroic figure, supported by a devoted wife. The narrative of their separation, when it emerged, was muted, framed as an amicable parting rather than an abandonment. The myth of the saintly, self-sacrificing spouse, the woman who stood by the great man, was too appealing to discard entirely, even after it was no longer true. But those close to the situation understood that something had broken. The system that had sustained Hawking for decades had been held together by Jane's labor and sacrifice. When she could no longer sustain it, when her own needs became undeniable, the system reconfigured around someone else. Elaine stepped in, not as a partner in the way Jane had been, but as a manager, a coordinator, someone whose role was explicitly professional, even if the relationship became personal. The shift from Jane to Elaine was also a shift in Hawking's mode of dependence. With Jane, the dependence had been intimate, familial, grounded in shared history and mutual obligation. With Elaine, it was transactional, organized, less emotionally entangled. Elaine managed his life with the efficiency of a professional caregiver. She controlled access to him, decided who could see him and when, maintained schedules with military precision. Some of Hawking's friends and colleagues found this troubling. They felt that Elaine isolated him, that she created barriers between Stephen and the people who had been part of his life for years. Others saw it as necessary. Stephen's life had become so complex, so demanding, that only rigorous organization made it manageable. What is certain is that the marriage was difficult. Rumors circulated, never fully confirmed, that Stephen was suffering mistreatment, unexplained bruises, concerning behaviors. A police investigation was opened in the early 2000s after reports from nurses. Stephen refused to cooperate. He insisted he was fine, that nothing was wrong. The investigation was dropped. Whether out of pride, loyalty, or something else, Hawking would not speak against Elaine. But the marriage ended in 2006, quietly and without public drama. They divorced, and Stephen's life reconfigured once more. By then, he'd been dependent on others for more than 40 years. The people changed, the technologies evolved, but the fundamental structure remained. Stephen Hawking could not exist without a system. And systems, no matter how well designed, are always subject to strain. Chapter 8: Mlodinow, Lectures and the Friction of Collaboration. After his divorce from Elaine, Stephen Hawking's intellectual and social life entered a new phase. He was in his 60s now, still productive but increasingly reliant on a network that had become vast and impersonal. His public lectures drew thousands. His pronouncements on topics ranging from artificial intelligence to extraterrestrial life made headlines worldwide. But behind the scenes, the work of producing these public performances was more collaborative and more fraught than ever. In 2005, Hawking began working with Leonard Mlodinow, a physicist and writer, on a new book that would eventually be published as The Grand Design. Mlodinow had collaborated with Hawking once before, co-authoring A Briefer History of Time, a condensed and updated version of the 1988 bestseller. That project had gone smoothly enough, but The Grand Design was more ambitious. It attempted to argue that the universe did not require a creator, that the laws of physics alone were sufficient to explain existence. Mlodinow later wrote a memoir, Stephen Hawking, a memoir of friendship and physics, in which he described the process of working with Hawking. It was, he said, both exhilarating and exhausting. Hawking's thinking was sharp, his intuitions often brilliant, but the labor of translating those intuitions into publishable prose fell almost entirely to Mlodinow. He would draft sections, send them to Hawking, wait days or weeks for a response. Often a single word, yes or no, or revise, and then revise again. The communication barrier was always present. Even with the computer, expressing complex ideas required enormous effort. Hawking could not casually talk through an argument, explore alternatives, workshop sentences. Every word had to be selected deliberately, laboriously. As a result, much of the actual writing was Mlodinow's, shaped by Hawking's yes-no approvals and occasional brief comments. This raised a question that had shadowed Hawking's work for decades. Where does authorship lie when one person provides the ideas and another does the writing? The books bore Hawking's name, and rightly so. The core arguments, the conceptual framework, the distinctive intellectual style were his. But the prose, the structure, the countless small decisions that shape a text, those came from others. Mlodinow did not resent this. He understood the arrangement and accepted it. But he also observed, with a mixture of affection and frustration, that Hawking could be stubborn. For example, Hawking insisted on including the phrase, philosophy is dead, and the grand design, knowing it would provoke controversy. Mlodinow argued it was unnecessarily inflammatory and not quite accurate. Hawking didn't really believe all philosophy was worthless, but Hawking wanted the provocation. He wanted to make a statement. so the phrase stayed. This was characteristic. Hawking enjoyed stirring debate, enjoyed being at the center of controversy. He made bold claims about God, about aliens, about the future of humanity that went beyond what the science strictly supported, because he understood that bold claims got attention. And attention, in turn, gave him a platform to discuss the science. But it also meant that his later work was sometimes more speculative than rigorous. His pronouncements on AI risk, on the dangers of contacting extraterrestrial civilizations, on the necessity of colonizing space, these were informed by scientific reasoning, but they were also thought experiments, provocations, warnings. They were not peer-reviewed results, they were Stephen Hawking, global icon, using his fame to shape public discourse. Some physicists found this troubling. They worried that Hawking's celebrity gave his speculations undue weight, that the public did not distinguish between his established contributions to black hole physics and his musings about the future. Others argued that Hawking was doing exactly what a public intellectual should do, using his expertise to engage with large, important questions, even if the answers were uncertain. Meanwhile, the logistical challenges of his existence continued to multiply. His daily routine required a rotating team of nurses, assistants, and technical specialists. His computer system, though advanced, was also fragile. Components would fail, software would crash, and experts would be called in to repair or replace them. He traveled constantly, giving lectures and attending conferences, which meant transporting not just himself, but an entire support apparatus. Wheelchair, ventilator, computer, battery backups, medical equipment, and at least 2 or 3 people to manage it all. His longtime collaborator, Thomas Hertog, described the surreal experience of working with Hawking on cosmological problems while surrounded by this infrastructure. They would discuss the wave function of the universe, the nature of time, the possibility of a multiverse, abstract, almost mystical concepts. And then a nurse would interrupt to perform a medical procedure, and the discussion would pause while Hawking's body was attended to. The contrast was jarring. The most abstract intellectual work happening in the context of the most concrete physical dependence. Hertog and Hawking spent years developing a theory they called top-down cosmology, which proposed that the universe's history is not fixed, but is determined, in a sense, by observation. It was a radical idea, arguably more philosophical than physical, and it never gained wide acceptance. But Hawking believed in it, or at least found it compelling enough to pursue. It was characteristic of his late style, bold, speculative, unafraid of strangeness. Hawking's final paper, completed with Hertog and published shortly before his death, concerned the multiverse, the idea that our universe might be one of many, each with different physical laws. The paper proposed a way to test this idea, at least in principle, by looking for signatures in the cosmic microwave background radiation. Whether the proposal was feasible remained an open question. Some physicists praised it as visionary. Others saw it as untestable speculation, dressed in mathematical formalism. What the paper demonstrated more than anything was that Hawking remained intellectually restless, even as his body continued to fail. He could no longer move anything except his cheek. His communication had slowed to a few words per minute, but his mind, his curiosity, his willingness to ask outrageous questions, those had not diminished. Chapter 9. The Late Style, Cosmos Without Boundary. In his final years, Stephen Hawking's public presence became increasingly symbolic. He was less a working scientist than an icon of science itself, a figure whose image signified human intellectual aspiration, the quest to understand the cosmos, the power of mind over material limitation. He continued to give lectures, though by now they were almost entirely pre-programmed. He would appear on stage, the synthesizer would speak, the audience would listen. But the performance was scripted, rehearsed, mediated by assistants who managed every detail. The spontaneity that had once characterized his public talks, his wit, his sharp responses to questions, was largely gone, replaced by carefully prepared remarks. In 2007, at age 65, Hawking participated in a zero-gravity flight, experiencing weightlessness for the first time. Photographs from the event show him floating free of his wheelchair, arms outstretched, grinning widely. It was a brief liberation. The flight provided only a few minutes of weightlessness, but it carried obvious symbolic weight. Here was a man who could not move on Earth, suspended in the air, unbound by gravity. He said afterward that it was one of the happiest experiences of his life. For a few moments, his body was no longer an impediment. The disease that had confined him for half a century was temporarily irrelevant. He floated like the particles in light he had spent his career studying, governed only by the fundamental forces of physics. It was also perhaps a preview. His later work increasingly concerned the possibility of escape. Escape from Earth, from the solar system, from the constraints of a single universe. He warned that humanity needed to become a spacefaring species, that staying on one planet was too risky, that extinction was inevitable unless we spread among the stars. These warnings were partly scientific, based on real risks like climate change, asteroid impacts, nuclear war, but they also carried a personal urgency. Hawking knew what it was to be trapped in a failing system, to depend on contingencies that could collapse at any moment. His warnings about artificial intelligence followed similar logic. He cautioned that AI could become an existential threat if not carefully managed, that machines might surpass human intelligence and pursue goals misaligned with human survival. Some critics dismissed these warnings as alarmist, but others saw them as prescient. Hawking understood dependence on systems better than most. He had spent his life embedded in systems, biological, technological, social, that sustained him but also constrained him. The idea that humanity might create a system it could not control resonated with his own experience. His final years also brought reconciliation. He and Jane, long estranged, reconnected. The bitterness of their separation softened into something more measured, an acknowledgement of shared history and mutual respect. She attended his events occasionally. They appeared together at the premiere of The Theory of Everything, the 2014 film about their relationship, which portrayed their marriage with more romance and less complication than the reality had contained. Jane later said that Stephen had become more reflective in old age, less driven by pure ambition, more willing to acknowledge the contributions of others. Whether this was true, or simply her interpretation, is impossible to say. Stephen himself rarely spoke about personal matters, even in interviews. His public statements remained focused on science, on the universe, on questions that transcended the individual. In his final published work, Brief Answers to the Big Questions, released posthumously, Hawking addressed topics he had circled throughout his career. Is there a God? How did it all begin? What is inside a black hole? Is time travel possible? The answers were brief, accessible, sometimes speculative. They were not breakthroughs, so much as summaries, a final accounting of what he believed and why. On the question of God, he was unequivocal. The universe does not require a creator. The laws of physics are sufficient. Time and space began with the Big Bang, so asking what came before is meaningless. There was no before. This was not a new position for Hawking, but restating it in his final book carried a certain finality, a closing argument in a lifelong debate. On March 14th, 2018, Stephen Hawking died at his home in Cambridge. He was 76 years old. He had lived 55 years beyond his initial prognosis, long enough to reshape cosmology, to become the most famous scientist of his generation, to be both celebrated and mythologized, far beyond what his work alone might have warranted. Tributes poured in from around the world. Colleagues praised his brilliance, his courage, his contributions to physics. The media replayed familiar narratives, the genius who defied expectations, the mind that transcended the body, the wheelchair-bound scientist who looked to the stars. His ashes were interred in Westminster Abbey, between Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin, a gesture that placed him among the pantheon of British scientific immortals. But the most fitting tribute might have been quieter, less grand. The acknowledgement that Stephen Hawking's life was not a story of solitary genius, but of profound interdependence. He needed others absolutely, and they, in turn, were shaped by their involvement in his life. His students who learned to think geometrically, his assistants who translated silence into action, his collaborators who extended his ideas into forms he could not produce himself. He was never alone. And the fact that this needed to be said, that the myth of the isolated mind persisted despite all evidence, is itself revealing. We want to believe in genius as singular, and great minds as self-sufficient. Hawking's life insisted otherwise. His brilliance was real. His insights were his own. But their realization depended on a web of people and machines, a system that was as essential to his identity as his mind. Epilogue. The machine outlives the man. Stephen Hawking's speech synthesizer still exists. The computer that gave him a voice, that allowed him to communicate for more than 3 decades, is preserved, archived, a historical artifact now. The voice itself, the flat, synthesized American accent that became more recognizable than his natural speaking voice ever was, can still be heard in recordings, in lectures saved on video, in the audiobook versions of his work. The voice outlives the man. This is not unusual. Einstein's equations outlive Einstein. Newton's laws outlive Newton. But something about Hawking's case is different. The voice was never his. It was always artificial, always mediated. And yet it became inseparable from who he was. To hear that voice is to hear Stephen Hawking, even though Stephen Hawking never produced it with his own body. This raises a question that has no easy answer. What remains when the body is gone, but the system persists? Hawking's ideas live on in textbooks, in ongoing research, in the thousands of physicists who studied his work or trained under him. His archive, housed at Cambridge, contains decades of correspondence, drafts of papers, media clippings, personal artifacts. It will be studied by historians of science for generations, a resource for understanding how knowledge is produced, how genius is constructed, how fame operates. But the archive also reveals what was lost. The diagrams his students drew no longer served their original function. The assistants who interpreted his minimal cues have scattered, their knowledge embodied but not easily transmitted. The computer system that enabled his communication is obsolete, a relic of older technology. The network that constituted Stephen Hawking has dissolved, its components dispersed, and yet something of him persists, not in a mystical sense, not as a spirit or a presence, but as an influence, a set of questions, a style of thinking that others have inherited and extended. His students went on to become professors themselves, training their own students, propagating not just his ideas, but his methods, the geometric intuition, the willingness to ask bold questions, the insistence on thinking visually rather than purely symbolically. His public legacy is more ambiguous. He became a symbol of triumph over adversity, which was both accurate and misleading. He did triumph in the sense that he accomplished extraordinary things despite devastating illness. But the narrative of triumph often obscured the dependence, the collaboration, the infrastructure required to make that triumph possible. It turned his life into inspiration, which can be a kind of erasure. Disability rights advocates have noted this tension. Hawking's visibility as a disabled person in public life was important. It challenged assumptions about what disabled people could achieve, about who gets to be a scientist, about the value of lives that do not conform to normative expectations. But the framing of his life as exceptional, as extraordinary precisely because he overcame his disability, also reinforced harmful ideas. It suggested that disability is something to be overcome, that the value of a disabled person lies in how well they approximate able-bodied norms. Hawking himself had complicated feelings about this. He did not want his disability to define him. He wanted to be known for his work, not his wheelchair. At the same time, he understood that his disability was part of his story, that it shaped how he thought and worked in ways both limiting and enabling. He used his platform to advocate for accessibility, for disability rights, for the National Health Service that kept him alive. But he resisted being reduced to a symbol. In his final years, he said he had no fear of death. He had lived longer than he ever expected, accomplished more than he imagined possible. He did not believe in an afterlife. He compared the brain to a computer that stops working when its components fail. When asked what he thought happened after death, he said, "I think the brain is like a program in the mind, which is like a computer. So it's theoretically possible to copy the brain onto a computer, and so provide a form of life after death. However, this is way beyond our present capabilities. I think the conventional afterlife is a fairy tale for people afraid of the dark." It was a characteristically blunt statement, unsentimental and materialist, but it also contained an implicit acknowledgement that identity, thought, consciousness, these are not ethereal or purely mental. They are embodied, physical, dependent on systems that can fail. And when the system fails, the person ends. Or perhaps not entirely. Perhaps the person persists in attenuated form, as influence, as memory, as the ideas they contributed to a collective project larger than any individual. Stephen Hawking's thoughts about black holes, about time, about the origin of everything, these are now part of the shared knowledge of humanity. They do not belong to him anymore. They belong to physics, to science, to the ongoing attempt to understand the universe. In that sense, he has not ended. He has dissolved into something larger, become part of the network he always depended on, a node in the vast web of human knowledge that continues to grow and evolve long after any single contributor is gone. This is not immortality, but it is a kind of persistence, and perhaps that is enough. The universe, Hawking often said, is governed by laws that are comprehensible, beautiful, and indifferent. It does not care about us. It does not mourn our passing. Stars collapse into black holes. Black holes evaporate into radiation. Eventually, over timescales too vast to imagine, even the radiation disperses, and the universe approaches a state of maximum entropy, heat death, the end of all structure, all complexity, all life. But in the brief interval between the Big Bang and the heat death, something remarkable happens. Matter organizes itself. Atoms form, stars ignite, planets coalesce, and on at least one planet, perhaps more, life emerges. And some of that life becomes conscious, capable of asking questions, of looking outward at the cosmos and inward at itself, of trying to understand. Stephen Hawking was part of that. A temporary concentration of matter and energy, organized in a way that could think, that could wonder, that could, despite immense physical limitation, reach toward the fundamental nature of reality. He did not find all the answers. No one does. The universe is large, and our time is short, and the questions are harder than we imagine. But he asked them. He asked them with rigor and imagination and a kind of stubborn refusal to accept mystery as final. And in asking, he changed what we know. Not alone, never alone, but genuinely, meaningfully, in ways that will echo forward as long as anyone is left to think about the stars. That is the legacy, not triumph, not heroism, not the myth of the disembodied genius. Just a mind in orbit, briefly, around the questions that matter most, and the system that made that orbit possible.